Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and I'm sure the Publications Review Board would approve of the material about my role in Scotland. Actually, at one point I had done some summer school work at the University of Edinburgh, and maybe it kind of underscores the importance of the things we're talking about today, but there is a war memorial at the castle in Edinburgh. Some of you may have been there. And you can open up these books and flip through and find relatives that fought in the Great War or in World War II. And here were John Lauders that had been killed in Scottish regiments in World War I. And it kind of sets the tone for this in a way. But before I go on to that, I want to thank you all for coming. I'm sort of delighted and pleased that there's so many people in the room. I'm sorry some of you have to sit in less comfortable chairs. But I'm heartened by the size of the audience, and I'm even more heartened with the interactions I've been able to have over the last day or so with faculty and students here at the school. These are important topics of non-proliferation and arms control, war and peace, and national security. It is not an easy business. And one thing that gives me some optimism is there's so many bright young folks coming along that have interest in the field and want to learn as much as they can of the history and the technology that's relevant. And I think if they continue, the country and the world will be in good hands. So I thank you all for your interest. I mentioned World War I a little bit because I was struck just getting ready for this presentation. You're trying to keep up with some of the new things that are in the press. And I saw an article been posted on a blog by an old colleague of mine, an old friend, Ambassador Joe DeThomas, who had been involved in a number of non-proliferation negotiations. And he had just posted a blog piece about the current North Korean crisis. It was entitled, "The Lamps Are Going Out All Over Asia." Those of you that are students of history will remember that in August 1914, Sir Edmund Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, had used almost that exact same phrase when he said the lamps are going out all over Europe. I think what Ambassador DeThomas was getting at in his piece was there are some crucial decisions that will be made in Washington. There will be crucial decisions that will be made in other capitals and other places about what comes next in North Korea. There will be some crucial decisions that are made about the status of the Iranian nuclear agreement that will unfold over the next few weeks. And those decisions will, in fact, help set the course. I don't want to be too Pollyannish about problems that are really intractable, and I'm not here to give you all sorts of answers for how one would necessarily work our way through the next steps with Iran and the next steps with North Korea. But the premise of what I want to chat about today, and I'll talk maybe for about 30, 35 minutes. I'll probably get long-winded, and Professor Slick will wave at me from time to time, because I know many of you have questions or comments, and I want to leave plenty of time for us to have a dialogue and to cover some of the points that you want. But in that 30 minutes or so, what I want to try to do is to say these problems may be very tough, but this is not the first time we have encountered tough problems in arms control and tough problems in arms control monitoring. And as Ken Burns has said sometimes on TV, talking about this new series on PBS on the Vietnam War, he said history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what I want to try to tease out are a few rhymes that I think have relevance for Iran and North Korea. One thing I won't have a lot of time to talk about today is how all this fits into the overall non-proliferation regime. But because of great planning on the part of the school, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins is actually talking later today, and she's going to cover that broader the changes in the non-proliferation regime. And so I encourage you to hear what she has to say on some points that I won't have time to address. We know from these past experiences, we know how to bring people to the negotiating table. We know how to break really tough monitoring problems into pieces that are more attackable. We know how to resolve issues at the negotiating table, both old issues and new ones that occur during the course of an agreement and negotiation. And when I talk about these lessons, I'm going to do so from my own personal perspective. First of all, I'm not here representing organizations. I'm talking only as an individual. But they're going to be the perspectives from somebody, as you heard in the introduction, that spent over 30-some years in the U.S. government dealing with some of these questions, and still get asked back from time to time to be part of the advisory panels. And I've been involved in some recent studies that I just want to mention to you all because you may want to go out and find them if you want some more details on this. Professor Slick already mentioned the Non-Proliferation Education Center, which actually has a new study coming out about the interaction of intelligence and policy and a whole series of non-proliferation and arms control issues. A book of case studies called Speaking Truth to Non-Proliferation, and that project, in fact, paid my plane ticket to come here to Texas to talk a little bit. There's another project too, since we're talking about PBS, funded by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and viewers like you, that has been an independent task force on nuclear verification that's done a series of reports. Here was one that came out about 2 years ago on 6 achievable steps for implementing an effective verification regime for a nuclear agreement with Iran. There's a new report that's coming out next week. It's going to talk a little bit about the impact of commercial imagery and social media and how one can draw that, the challenges and opportunities that come from that proliferation of information for arms control monitoring. And I'll mention some other studies as we go on. I'm going to mainly talk about the monitoring of an agreement and the verification process and the role of intelligence in that. But maybe we'll tease out some larger points as we go through the discussion. This being an institution of higher learning, we should have a few educational moments, and let me start with definitions. And this is John Lauder's version of this definition, but I think it's the right definition. You will hear folks talk about the monitoring of international agreements, and you will hear the phrase verification of international agreements. And there is a difference. Monitoring is essentially the process of gathering information. I hope those of you on the side can see the slides. I'll try not to block you too much. But it's basically the gathering of information that's relevant to compliance assessments. There's a wonderful term of art that's used in the arms control world called national technical needs. In a trick question, I would encourage my professor friends to give their students from time to time is to ask them to define what national technical needs is. To the best of my knowledge, we have not, for good reason, ever defined in an agreement what that means, because it means various things to different people and it's meant to be fungible. But the rubric of it is, it's the intelligence contribution to the monitoring process. It tends to be used to mean satellite imagery, but it means more than that, and how much more it means that is left to the eye of the beholder. But the monitoring process not only involves that, but it involves diplomacy, it involves negotiated measures such as information exchanges, on-site inspections, and open source material. And all that gathers a tremendous amount of information that then flows up to our political masters, those people who are in fact elected by all of you to make political judgments and to be the policy level. And it is reserved for that level the judgment on verification about whether an agreement is doing what it's supposed to do and whether it's being complied with. it is not an automatic process by which monitoring leads to a political verification judgment. And that's for a number of reasons. Because any individual agreement fits into an overall context of U.S. strategic interest, the interest of our allies, the current international situation. And so there will be cases in the past that you'll see in some of these case studies where there would have been concern in the non-proliferation community and the U.S. government about the pace of nuclear weapons development in a country like Pakistan, for example. But yet what the United States and our allies did about it was affected by what else was going on in U.S.-Pakistan relations, needing the help of Pakistan in Afghanistan at various stages. And so those trade-offs are being done. You will have read that the President of the United States will soon need to make a decision, which is required to make every 90 days as part of the implementing act. That was the congressional blessing for the Iran agreement, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, among the P5+1, the 5 official nuclear weapon states, plus Germany, the European Union sitting in Iran. The congressional legislation requires the president to make a decision every 90 days about whether he's going to certify that agreement as being in the interest of the United States. A verification judgment. So you've seen reporting where the International Atomic Energy Agency has said Iran is in technical compliance, essentially. You've seen, I think, the commander of STRATCOM said the same thing. But the president can, in fact, decide, for broader reasons, in the case of Iran, what about its other behavior in places like Syria? What about other things that aren't the technical part of the agreement, but is there any indications that Iran's still interested in nuclear weapons, as evidenced by their missile tests and other things they might be doing, in which the political judgment could in fact be not to certify. But I spent time in that definition to show that those two worlds intersect and how they intersect. Another thing on definitions for those of you in non-proliferation arms control world is agreements of the sort that we're talking about are really designed to do 3 different types of things. And some agreements do all 3. I would argue where we are with Iran and North Korea, in fact, will touch on all 3. One is the prevention of horizontal proliferation, and that is a state that does not have nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, to prevent those states from getting it, or to prevent states that do have that technology from sharing with others. North Korea is clearly a case where it has advanced along in its nuclear weapons program, but North Korea has, over the last decades or so, been a tremendous source of technology related in particular to missile proliferation. The North Korean Nodon missile has been the model used in a number of other countries for missiles of similar range. The Iranian Shahab-3 looks an awful lot like a North Korean Nodon missile, in part because of relationship back and forth. Vertical proliferation is a state that has a program like nuclear weapons. How do you keep it from getting better and going to the next stage? And we're at that sort of cusp with North Korea right now, where, I'm not behind double green doors. I don't know exactly what that last nuclear test looked like, but North Korea has now done 6 tests. And this last one, when you look at the seismic squiggles, it's pretty dramatic how much more of a seismic signal this last test gave, which has led folks to say, they may be right. This could be a hydrogen bomb as opposed to an atomic bomb, and they really have reached a state in their development. And then agreements that either help facilitate the rollback of weapons of mass destruction capability, or at least provides a strategic stability. And the sorts of arrangements the U.S. and the former Soviet Union and now Russia have done on strategic arms have been certainly part of those, and there's lessons from that could apply to North Korea and Iran. And we've had agreements that have rolled back Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, even though they were former Soviet states that had nuclear weapons on their territory and programs, no longer have of those programs because they gave it up as part of the agreements that ended the Cold War. A big part of, I think, the points I want to make are on this slide. So, when we look at prior negotiations and prior agreements that have been successful, I'll probably read a little bit of the slide for some of you that are along the fringes here. There's some been aspects of those successes that sort of give us a model about how are we doing or how should we do. One is that sort of the integration of military and economic sticks and negotiated carrots. Being an intelligence officer that's been involved in arms control, I always thought I was doing the right job when both sides hated me. And what I mean by both sides, if you're a card-carrying member of the arms control mafia, that you love agreements, you don't necessarily like the person that's coming in and saying, well, here's some tough things we got to do in terms of monitoring. Or you don't necessarily like the defense official that comes in and says, I can bring this person to the table if I deploy a new defense program. And if you're on the real hardline side, you don't particularly like the person that says, I think we can do an agreement here because I think there's some things we can negotiate. But when we have had successful arms control agreements, I would argue, it's been an application of those carrots and sticks together. And the classic one was the INF agreement, the agreement that essentially banned the Russians and the US from having intermediate range of ballistic missiles. And it sort of started when the Russians introduced the SS-20, which threatened to be very destabilizing in Europe and threatened to decouple the US nuclear deterrent from Europe. And NATO agreed on what they called a dual stage policy. One aspect of that was we, the United States, working with our NATO allies, were going to deploy weapon systems to counter what the Russians had done with the SS-20. We put the Pershing II in Europe. We put ground-launched cruise missiles. But we said, the world is not a better place because both of us have these new sets of missiles threatening each other, so let's negotiate them away. And we had something to negotiate at the table, and by the end of 1987, we had agreed to the INF agreement. One of the reasons that works is that it's informed by a strategy. How do you use the instruments of national power with the instruments of negotiation to resolve crises and situations? You got to think ahead on the chessboard. And it's also anticipatory. I said earlier, part of what we're trying to get at is to stop horizontal proliferation or vertical proliferation. The easiest time to stop proliferation is when a country decides, sort of has that inkling that, gee, I live in a bad neighborhood and my life would be better if I had nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons. It's easier to dissuade countries at that stage than when they get to the stage, particularly of a North Korea or an Iran, where then you're talking about, in this problem, do I have to employ military force? And what are the economic levers that I have to employ? That's why anticipation matters. That's why I sort of commend the talk by Ambassador Jenkins, because part of it is to have a regime that keeps you from being in these situations where we are now, particularly with North Korea. The other thing that has been important in the past is a degree of bipartisan consensus in support for the strategy and the arms control and non-proliferation component of it. You will not be surprised to learn from those of us who live in the Washington area that bipartisanship is not something we see a whole lot of on Capitol Hill these days. And one of the reasons, there's lots of reasons for it. I'm not a domestic policy guy, so I'm not going to go into that. But it used to be that there were folks and staff, members and staff, Sam Nunn, for example, comes to mind, that were really expert in these sorts of things that we're talking about here today. That sort of expertise is less entrenched on Capitol Hill for a whole reason. And so these issues get caught up in the politics of the moment and not necessarily in the overall strategic front. The third bullet is substantial resources for monitoring. To you taxpayers, for those of us in the monitoring community, let me say thank you. This stuff is expensive. Satellites are expensive. On-site inspections are expensive. Cheaper than military conflict. But there are substantial resources on the part of the U.S. government, on the part of international organizations, on the part of our allies that need to be committed. And in a decade or so where we've had significant budget problems, we've had the sequester, where there have been limits on what could be spent. Some of the resources that have been available for monitoring are not there anymore. I'll come back to that maybe a little bit later. The other point, it came up in one of the classes yesterday, is even under ideal circumstances, there aren't enough resources to go around. And there will be times when we'll be focusing resources on Afghanistan or Iraq or North Korea, and some other development will take place, normally among a friend. One thing that Professor Slick didn't use in his introduction, I actually had encouraged him to use, is the one thing that I think gives me credibility standing up here in front of you today is not all the nice things he said, but rather that I've been a perpetrator of many intelligence failures. And I've learned from those failures. And some of those failures, there's always multiple reasons for a failure, but you had mentioned that I had been director of the DCI Non-Proliferation Center. On my watch, the Indians did their nuclear test in 1998, and I was as surprised as anybody when somebody came into my staff meeting and said the Indians had just tested. And one of the reasons is, we had friendly relationships with India. We weren't looking as hard in India as we were in some other areas. There were a whole series of other reasons too. But there's great capacity for surprise. I'll come back to that a little bit in the context of Northeast Asia in a minute. In fact, let me make that point now. We talked about the need for a comprehensive strategy. These challenges that we face with Iran and North Korea are in some ways more complex than some of the challenges we faced in the Cold War. Cold War, you've got the United States, and you've got the Soviet Union, and we sort of understood each other. We knew what our capabilities were. In Northeast Asia right now, this is a very unique negotiation that may transpire, or at least a strategic Rubik's Cube, because you have 4 nuclear powers that have a stake in this. You have North Korea, you have the United States, you have Russia and China. They all have stakes. And then you've got 2 powers that are really, for all practical purposes, threshold nuclear states, Japan and South Korea. Lots of interesting literature. I'm not here to tell you I don't know. There are historical and cultural reasons why Japan may not want to have a nuclear weapons program, but if they decided to do so because of concern about North Korea, they could turn that on within days, weeks, certainly months. There's enough plutonium in Japan as part of its power programs that if they were to marshal that plutonium into nuclear weapons, they could have some studies, unclassified studies, that said they could have 2,500 nuclear weapons. That's more than the U.S. has deployed on our missiles and our bombers at the moment. That could happen fairly quickly. South Korea might take a little longer, but I saw an article the other day from a South Korean scientist. It was a translation from a Korean journal, and he said they could have a nuclear weapons program if they choose to do so because they're concerned about the North in 6 months. I don't think that's a good idea to have 6 nuclear-armed powers in Northeast Asia in the midst of all this. Lots of things could go wrong. I'm not sure that it bolsters the deterrent, but that's part of this comprehensive Rubik's Cube we're trying to work. It also needs international commitment. I will argue, and I do argue, that in the U.S., arms control monitoring and arms control negotiations a team sport. It requires the interagency. Internationally, it's a team sport. Increasingly, agreements now are negotiated by international coalitions. They are implemented by international coalitions and international organizations. Look at the Iran agreement. the P5+1, and Iran being the parties. That's why it's sometimes hard to change it too, because you have to get the agreement of all those parties to do it in some way. And the other thing is the effective monitoring process. Arms control and non-proliferation agreements are not fire and forget. You don't just negotiate it and say, okay, I've got a monitoring mechanism in place. You've got to work that from. You've got to invest in it. You've got to manage it in a variety of ways. And I do worry a little bit why I began by saying I'm glad there are people in this room that are aspiring to careers in this area. You have to have experienced and knowledgeable participants in that process. And you have to have a proven methodology for monitoring. Let me just say a little bit about that methodology and how it might apply a little bit in Iran and North Korea's plan. There is a wonderful term of art. You know, we talked about national technical meetings. There's another wonderful term of art in the arms control monitoring process called militarily significant. And that's a license that gives you a little bit of ambiguity. Not trying necessarily to monitor an agreement like the one with Iran that's every dotted I and every crossed T, but to provide a little bit of what matters. And what matters varies from negotiation. Professor Slick mentioned that I was involved in the conventional forces in Europe negotiation, went down to Capitol Hill to testify on our ability to monitor that agreement. And normally the intelligence committee testifies after the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those are in some ways the two most important testimonies in any agreement, because the military says what they can live with in terms of military significance, and the IC says, can we monitor it to that ability? In the conventional forces in Europe, I got to testify in open hearing right after the chairman, and I was so delighted to hear it. Actually, the director was testified, I was backing him up, and in the closed section, he left and I got to be in the chair. You know, for all the grilling that you see. But the JCS had testified, we think a militarily significant violation of CFE would be one tank army. I can find a tank army in Europe. If I can't find a tank army in Europe, we've got more problems than arms control monitoring. In the case where we're talking about nuclear weapons, a militarily significant violation is something that it's not just a tank army. It may be somebody squirreling away a weapon or something. Does Iran have a weapon somewhere in a basement somewhere? Exactly what does North Korea have? What are they moving toward? The significance level is more challenging. But how you get at that in the monitoring process is a synergy that has to be managed in some way that uses those national technical means, those intelligence means, the public available information, the inspection process, and uses each element of it as to help to form the other as forcing events. On inspections, for example, I sometimes say you need an investigative mindset. Some of you are old enough to remember the old Columbo TV series. I want arms control inspectors are kind of like Inspector Columbo. They're leaving the room, and it's just kind of turned back to the room and say, just one more thing. I want to tell Mrs. Columbo tonight about this box over here in the corner. Can you tell me more about this box over here in the corner? That sort of let me go on and elicit some information that might in fact be useful. Good agreements establish consultative mechanisms for the resolutions of conflict and the maintenance of the implementation plan. In the Iran agreement, such a commission was set up called the Joint Commission. It meets regularly, it has subgroups. It is a forum that can be used, and I'll have a slide here and show you some of the things it can be used for. This is a pet peeve on mine, is that agreements should help build transparency. They should help. Arms control and non-proliferation agreements basically just buy time. It buys time for states to change the focus of their national security policy, maybe to change their regimes. And to buy time, you want those states to change in a way that they're more open. I got a guffaw when I was testifying on the Hill on the Iran agreement, sort of an expert witness, and I report against, but talking about monitoring. And I used the phrase, we need to bring Iran toward a culture of compliance. And this is a little bit of what's John been smoking. But it is, that's what we're trying to get. There's another set of studies that I commend to you all, done by the Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control. Actually, I've had two interesting papers. A new one just came out last week on building greater transparency in the Iranian agreement. Because right now, there's actually less information that's publicly available about Iran's nuclear program than there was before the agreement because of some understandings that were done. I'm not sure that's a healthy process. I'm not sure it brings the Iranians to where we want to bring them. So the reason those consultative commissions matter, and I'm going to wind up here a little bit for questions. I won't go through all the slides, but this, again, another teaching moment. One of the great gurus of the arms control world was Freddie Clay. Back in 1961, January 1961, he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs that was entitled After Detection What? And his premise being, if states that are party of arms control agreement, this was the time when we were about to enter into this with the Soviet Union on a test ban. If countries believe, no matter how good your monitoring process is, and Clay understood that difference between monitoring and verification, that even if they thought you would detect their noncompliance, unless they had some assurance that you would act upon that evidence of noncompliance in a way that would change their strategic calculus, that you've really undermined the agreement. And that good agreements have to be grounded on what's that next step on the chessboard. What if Iran cheats? What if North Korea enters into another agreement and cheats again? How do we deal with this? How do we use the instruments of power? And the consultative mechanisms I talked about before are the first step. I mentioned the conventional forces in Europe. The first day of we had just initialed the agreement, and the Russians lied to us essentially about their holdings in Europe as part of the data exchange. And what we said was, we're still going to initial the agreement, we're still going to sign the agreement, but we're going to immediately talk in the consultative commission that we set up. We're going to talk about the data, what we see to be the inadequacy of your data declaration. We have that consultative mechanism set up for Iran, as I mentioned earlier. We can set one up for North Korea. And what that consultative mechanism lets you do, in addition to dealing with the questions of noncompliance, it lets you do renegotiation. There are those that say there's aspects of the Iran agreement that need to be renegotiated. We have a forum in the Joint Commission where you can do that. I'm not saying the Iranians necessarily would be easy to bring to have that discussion. I'm not necessarily saying other members of the P5+1, but there is a mechanism that exists already that would let us have discussions about missile limits, or at least say, do we need another negotiation? That would let us do inspection experiments and voluntary compliance measures. And again, these are all things that I would look for in a North Korean agreement when you get one. CTR is cooperative threat reduction. At the end of the Cold War, we established a number of these programs with the former Soviet Union to find reemployment and repurposing for the Soviet nuclear weapons complex and the scientists. Same sort of thing. You have people who have been working on nuclear weapons programs in Iran and North Korea. How can we give them other more productive work rather than working on those programs? And then regional exchanges on things like safety and the environment. You will not be surprised to know, you will see it in the unclassified literature. Lots of conversations going on now in Northeast Asia. Old retired people like me spend some time on planes going off and chatting with folks in Beijing or South Korea or wherever about what's in the realm of the possible. Well, you can have a conversation regionally. So let's talk about the environmental dangers of nuclear weapons programs in Northeast Asia. What kind of joint planning can we do? And then it can be a springboard for other discussions. I'm going to skip that slide just to say, I think you know that we've had this legacy of success from the Cold War. But let me just make a couple points about why the current challenge is a little harder so I don't sound too Pollyannish. In the end of the Cold War, when we were doing arms control, it was pretty easy, relatively so to now, because you were counting missiles, you were counting bombers. We're talking about agreements now that are counting weapons or trying to identify where nuclear weapons are. And even more importantly, really trying to assess industrial facilities. Is this or a reactor producing material that can be diverted to purposes of weapons? And often those judgments are judgments about intentions, where the signatures are not so clear as to a missile or a bomber about their capabilities. We're talking about a global situation now. We're again talk about that strain on the monitoring community about what it would look like to have enhanced monitoring of the Iran agreement. If we had a new Korean agreement, if we had others on a regional basis in Northeast Asia or the Middle East, the demands it would put on the technical base of an organization like the International Atomic Energy Agency, but the language skills that would be required for inspectors and others to participate in the process. One of the studies I participated in a couple years back was a Defense Science Board Task Force study about nuclear monitoring. It took a couple years to get done. It was actually signed out by Ash Carter in terms of reference. But we looked at the research and development. We looked at the availability of inspectors internationally that one would need for agreements, and developed a work program that said, here's what you need to do. At the time, we were driven by the possibility, President Obama gave a speech in Prague saying it's going to be the goal of the United States to have a world free of nuclear weapons. And our challenge was, how would we monitor that? Now, it looks like we're in a world, we're on the verge of a new nuclear arms race in some ways, but the demands are still the same on the monitoring community. And what I mentioned before about a strategically significant non-compliant can occur at lower levels. Let me wind up real fast with just these next two slides, and I'll stop for your questions and comments. The good news is, I said there's some new challenges. The good news is there's a lot of capabilities now that we have that can apply in Iran, apply in North Korea, apply on other problems. One is we really now know how to do wide area surveillance. Look at all the things we did in Iraq trying to follow the improvised explosive device or problem, particularly in a permissive environment where you have access to the airspace. We know how to do precise spatial awareness and geolocation from space and other assets. We know how to do forensic intelligence, and that is, again, I'll use the Iraq IED problem. If somebody has planted a device, you can work back in your surveillance and say, well, where was that device built? How did it get there? Can I work it back? That has all sorts of implications for arms control monitoring, too. What's going on at this facility? Where did that material come from? Where did it go from? We have a whole range of commercial available imagery and radar that supplements that of the national technical needs of the U.S. National Reconnaissance Office, for example. We have development of international verification institutions. I mentioned the IAEA, but you also have the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, and other international assets that we rely on. We're really a lot better on data mining and analytics in ways that I don't have to remind you all and come back to in discussion. And we have this proliferation of social media sources, even in places like North Korea, where we have websites like 38 North that are just full of all sorts of information out of what essentially is a closed society. But against that, there are new challenges. We still haven't figured out, because the laws of physics work against us, how you can stand off in space and detect a nuclear weapon that's shielded in some place on the ground. You've got to be close. I said we know how to do continuous surveillance over areas where we have airspace. I'm not sure that it works as well for a place like North Korea, and where you don't have a permissive air environment, you have to rely on standoff. The underground facility problem is a challenge. There are some solutions to it, but they're expensive and they're technical and certainly can be done, but underground facilities are a challenge. Mobile targets are a challenge. We're talking about both an Iranian and North Korean missile force that can be fairly mobile and moving around. Establishing that baseline. One of my critiques about the current Iran agreement that I was sorry we didn't get in negotiation, which I think is key to international arms control agreements, is the parties ought to have an information declaration to begin. I would have liked to have heard from Iran. How far did they get in their nuclear weapons development program? Where was the material? Who were the scientists involved? When I talked to Iranians about this, what they've said, but that would just give you a target list for later. I said, no, we want to move on to the future, but we need to know where you were in the past. And we didn't push for that as hard as I would have liked to have seen us do, because you have to have that income tax return, it seems to me, to be able to then have a baseline for monitoring. I think we should press the North Koreans hard if we get to a negotiation with them on it. And there has been an atrophy. Oh, the signal-to-noise problem. I mentioned the good news about social media, but now we're flooded with information, and you're trying to pull out the nugget that's most important to monitoring out of that flood. Well, if you're a society like North Korea, whose economic prosperity relies on things like counterfeiting and cyber attacks and denial and deception in a variety of ways. And we're now in this era where we talk about fake news. It's easy, if you're trying to deceive somebody about the nature of your program, to introduce false information into this problem set where you've got more signal, you've got more clutter than you have signal. And then you've had this atrophy of some of the key organizations. We used to have an arms control disarmament agency in the U.S. We don't have that anymore. That was a certain source of expertise. I don't want to be critical of the current administration, but I do worry a little bit about unfilled positions in Washington. Down at the State Department for meetings over the last few weeks. It is a quieter place than I remember it being a few years ago. There are empty positions. These are team sports. You need that interagency team. There are positions that are unfilled in defense. You need those folks to be able to put together good agreements and to monitor it. And we've come out of an era where we've been focused in the intelligence community a lot about current intelligence. We'll talk about this, go through in Professor Slick's class after this in more detail than we have time to do here. We've been focused on counterterrorism, appropriately so, counterinsurgency, Iraq and Afghanistan. These are not the same skills in your national security establishment that are as applicable to how you're going to monitor an enhanced agreement for Iran or North Korea. Let me stop there. I've got other slides. The big build-up toward the end says this isn't going to happen by itself. It requires leadership. It requires the engagement of the Congress. It requires the engagement of the administration. It requires this interagency team. But there are these practices from the past that can help inform the decisions so that we know if we're hearing the right. So I want to provide at least 20, 25 minutes or so for your comments and questions. And what didn't I cover that I should have? Let's look at
Use my privilege and ask the first question. So many of us, old-time lexicons in this area, we remember technology transfer limitations, COCOM, issues like this. The underlying theory of the case being that there were certain key elements of knowledge, know-how, and certain components and ingredients that if you could control the trade in them, you could deny people the right to have the will of acquiring these dangerous technology. So given the leveling of the earth, the growth in digital technology, the rise of non-state actors that will hardly attribute content to certain people, is there a future for tech transfer limitations, or is everybody going to know everything in the future?
I'm of the John Lauder speaking personally. I think as you implied in your question, this world of the internet that we're in now, and we have 3D printing and all sorts of things, is the ability to deny a country or even a non-state actor that wants to be in the weapons of mass destruction realm is a lot more difficult than it was 20 years ago, for all of the factors you said. That doesn't mean for certain core bits of information that we shouldn't still try to control that, and that we still shouldn't try to control some technology. But things like computer technology or so. First of all, it's not in the ability of the United States necessarily to control that technology when a lot of it now comes from places like China, and places like North Korea and Iran have built up an industrial base. What I think is more important is to have transparency into those trading relationships. What kinds of material, talk about that, Deca, what kinds of materials are being acquired, what kind of expertise is being sought, because there's clues in that. If you can get through that signal to noise problem, there are clues there that might lead you to a program. I've always been the sense that we should spend some more time thinking about who some of the key individuals are, who are the key scientists. What about the money flows? What about the financial flows? Who are the middlemen that might be engaged in transactions? That's where I would put a lot of my emphasis into. Sir.
It's interesting that you commented on the Iran agreement, so I'll ask you a question about that. Our president says the worst agreement we've ever signed. So if we take out the money side of it, is the agreement faulty in the things that you hold dear, the monitoring, the verification, the consulting process? And so that's sort of the front end. And the back end is, you made a comment, well, let's see if there shouldn't be a change in the country. Well, assume it doesn't happen, because that's one good assumption. Are the Iranians better off and more capable of building a nuclear weapon after the agreement? Do we contribute? Are we contributing?
It's an excellent question, and it's clear that question is at the center of this policy debate that's underway. From my own personal perspective, alluded to a little bit in my presentation, there's two things I would have liked to have seen in the Iran agreement that aren't there. Understanding that it's an international negotiation, you can't always get what you want, there's always compromise. One element was this declaration and the ability of the International Atomic Energy Agency to say how far Iran has been in the development of its nuclear weapons program and how does it relate to its missile programs or whatever. There's still some ambiguity there. That may or may not be resolved through the IAEA monitoring that's underway related to the agreement, but that's a slow process at the moment, and I think a lot of us, the international community, not entirely satisfied with the volume of information that's available. The second challenge is that the Iran agreement is time limited in many of its provisions. Some expire 10, 15 years out. So as you say in your question, will we be better off 10 years from now if Iran then can start spinning up more advanced centrifuges, can do research and development? And how do you answer that question is a lot about what happens in those 10 years. That's why I argue for things like greater transparency. I want to be in meetings with the Revolutionary Guard. I want to be in meetings with the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. You want to have that dialogue. You want to have a strategic dialogue about, you want to come back into the family nations as a great power, as the great Persian Empire that you were. Nuclear weapons is not going to help you do that. There's other ways that you can do it. Let's work about repurposing these scientists. So I think the jury is out on that question. Unfortunately, it's not an easy answer. That's why I make the point that says, even within the agreement, again, assuming you can get the Iranians to come to the table and negotiate with you, and if you can get our allies to agree to do the same, we can go into that consultative commission and start talking about these things. There is one card that we have, and the Iranians in some ways I think are disappointed with the agreement in one sense. I think they hoped that when the agreement was signed that international trade would open up to them in a larger way than it has. And it hasn't, because if you're an international company, with some exceptions, you're thinking, can I do due diligence in Iran where I still don't have transparency? How long is this agreement going to last? What's going to be the future of the Iranian government? So I'm not, as an international banker, I don't want to invest much in Iran. I don't want to necessarily engage in big trade agreements right now. Do I know better what that strategic situation is going to look like a few years from now? And I think, I am being Pollyannish here, I think one could have that dialogue and say, you, Iran, are going to be better served to agree to some of these additional provisions because the rewards are going to be so much greater for it. And they're out of our control in some ways. It is how you're perceived in the international business community is going to matter. Sorry. Now.
Do you think, looking back, that we should have held out for a stronger agreement that dealt with missile systems, that perhaps dealt with other developments, terrorism?
Yeah, it's hard to. There's always that thing about what's your negotiating power and how much you're going to get out of an agreement. I think what I would say is I would not be reticent in pushing for discussions with Iran on missiles, pushing for discussions with Iran on support to terrorism, as we build upon the nuclear agreement, rather than burning one agreement with that. And that's part of what we did in the Cold War too. We had strategic arms control understandings and negotiations agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but we also had broader fora in which we were talking about things like human rights. And I think that was important in the weakening of the monolithic Soviet Union. It began to crack on things like human rights and immigration and trade. That the arms control agreements provided some breathing space for those forces to take place. And so that's what I think we ought to be doing with Iran. I think we should be doing that with North Korea. Yes.
One of the complicating factors that I foresee with negotiating with North Korea is the element to which their nuclear program is tied to their national narrative, and there's an existential nature to that. So what lessons can we use, or maybe is this a new challenge? How does that inform the negotiations, this existential nature of their program?
You're quite right. That's part of the challenge. In recent history does not help us in that regard. We had very successful understanding with Libya to give up their weapons of mass destruction programs. If you're in North Korea, you're looking and say, what happened to Gaddafi after that? And you look at it's Saddam Hussein. So that underscores, I think, it's here. I'm not savvy enough on North Korea to say, how would I get the North Koreans to the table on this question? I am pretty confident we can get the Chinese to the table and the Russians to the table on these sorts of things. And they have ways to add pressure on North Korea. It may be that, and this is John Lauder speaking just off the top of his head, it could be you come up with something like, we're all going to be better off with Korean unification. And maybe we have a unified Korea without U.S. forces there. Oh, by the way, China, you've got your friends in the Korean government. Help us get rid of who the president refers to as Rocket Man, or you get rid of him, or whatever, and we'll work out some negotiating. And we have leverage with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese are, and the Russians are very concerned about the buildup in missile defense that we're putting in Northeast Asia. I think they're going to even be more concerned when we start building up military forces in a way, and that's going to help give them a stake in how do we resolve the situation. I saw Rand Paul was on TV this morning talking about how the ways in which you bring China in. There are all sorts of ideas floating around about how to do this. But having said about dual track on INF, I think we've gotten the Chinese and the Russian attention a little bit. Not something we wanted to do, kind of brought about by the North Korean developments, but with putting more missile defense assets in Northeast Asia, the Russians and the Chinese see that as a threat to their systems, even though the target is North Korea. It's in their interest to negotiate that way, and what they have to deliver are the North Koreans and so on. Sorry.
One thing we didn't address is the risk from a terrorist group.
Yes.
How do you monitor, say, the movement of a dirty bomb to New York?
Right.
And that seems to me would be the greater risk. The other, because of mutually assured destruction, that probably is going to avoid rockets flying at each other. But how can you monitor all the nuclear material that has disappeared in the old Soviet Union that one day would appear in the harbor of New York City?
Right. Well, I think that's the other big question. It was beyond the scope of what I was trying to address today, but what it links is there is this debate that goes on about would the world be safer if there were more nuclear weapon states than less nuclear weapon states? I'm in the school of thought that says less is better than more. There are lots of reasons why less is better than more. Part of it is the possibility of accident. Part of it's the possibility of unauthorized launch. But part of it is how you control the materials that are available. So I think by dampening down the number of nuclear weapons programs, you begin to dampen down the amount of material that's available. The second part of that, where I mentioned cooperative threat reduction programs, how do you repurpose the nuclear establishment? How do you redirect the scientists and engineers, the folks that could help a terrorist group? But I'm very concerned about that because there's expertise out in the world that's conceivably for sale. There's material that can be diverted. The IAEA and others spend a lot of time on accounting for nuclear materials. But I made that point earlier, it can't be everywhere. And you do still worry. The nuclear threat initiatives, Sam Nunn and others have been spending a lot of time thinking about this problem. They've called for a number of actions. They have dramatic videos. You can go to their website. We got one related to Fred Thompson's playing the President of the United States, and there's material that's being smuggled in that's going to set off an improvised nuke in a U.S. city. And the idea is to get the attention of the policy level that this is a serious problem you have to deal with now, because when you get the warning that a terrorist group has put in New York City or Austin or wherever an improvised nuclear device, that's the last time. That's too late for you to deal with it in an effective way. You want to stop it at the source, and that's why I said I'd like to focus on individual. I think it's important to look at those intersections between those with radical ideology and terrorist groups and those with technical expertise and the access to material and money that could bring together this possibly existential threat. Sir?
Right, I'm going to use INF as an example of a successful monitoring program. But as you know, INF is effectively on its last legs,
Right.
along with the Convention Force in Europe Treaty. Open skies, I've even heard, is in danger. Cooperative threat reduction and new disarmament treaties with Russia are effectively out of the question. So my question to you is, the challenges that are emerging that have nothing to do with the technical issues of monitoring and everything to do with the political will and the intention. The Cold War provided a very neat picture for policymakers to understand the importance of ongoing monitoring efforts. How can we generate the organizational capacity and political will in sort of shifting sands to uphold these efforts over long periods of time?
First of all, let me say your question, it sounds a little bit like a dialogue I had with my son, who's a history teacher in high school, and he actually turned to me a few months ago and says, "Gee, Dad, your life sucks, you know." These treaties, these agreements are all falling apart. And that's actually, in some ways, I think part of this is the Freddie Clay article that I had. It's not just the monitoring mechanisms. There's a lot of political will that goes behind it. again, I don't mean to sound excessively optimistic, but I think there are answers. Part of this is what's that grand strategy? What is the role of military forces, economic leverage, the shining city on the hill, human rights? How do you orchestrate all of that with arms control and non-proliferation agreements to get outcomes that you want? I actually think, John Waters speaking, and this is where you're going to probably going to be subject to a random drug test now, having said that, is I actually think you can start exploring things like regional INF agreements, global INF agreements. The Russians can't be happy about some of the developments in the world. The Russians want to be treated like a great power still. Iran wants to be treated like a great power. North Korea wants to be treated like a great power. Well, if you treat somebody with a certain degree of respect, you can come in and say, okay, we've got a mutual problem here. The solution would be an agreement along these lines, which would, the Russians don't particularly, I don't think, like being pariahs in the international world. They brought it on themselves with Ukraine, Crimea, and others. But there may be solution sets out there that some dialogue helps. That's also why I think kind of dampen down the rhetoric a little bit. When the Soviet Union was, one of the reasons that I'm a few pounds overweight is when the Soviet Union was collapsing, and I was in Vienna, Austria at the time, we spent a lot of time by design with our Russian counterparts, talking about the good old days of the Great Patriotic War and whatever. And we would, pound vodka and sit in saunas, and it was just, I couldn't do the memcons after we talked about this last night. I couldn't do the memcons. After I couldn't quite remember, but we knew we were, we could solve this. And I think you have to go into that attitude that there are some things that are still possible. Sir, and I saw Alan's hand.
You mentioned in regard to North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. How does the Iran agreement look to the Saudis?
Well, thank you. And I should have mentioned that. What I talked about, how we have this complicated Rubik's Cube. There are stakeholders to agreements that they're not parties to. And in the Middle East, you've got the Israelis looking at the Iran agreement. And certainly there are differences of view depending on who you talk to in Israel. The Saudis look upon it where there's this natural rivalry between the Saudis and the Gulf states and Iran for influence in the Middle East. And so whatever is done, if we do go into this, consult with the commission or do some renegotiating, whatever, the stakeholders have to have some confidence that this agreement is making the world a better place to live, even though they may not get all they want and they may not be parties there. And if you don't get it right, just like Northeast Asia, I mentioned Japan and South Korea, I think the Middle East, you don't want to see a Saudi bomb, you don't want to see a Turkish bomb. And so getting these things right helps dampen down that impetus.
Hi, John, you made reference several times to this seminal 1961 article by Freddie Clay, After Detection What? And it says that if the other side is in this agreement, the only reason they would have to observe the agreement is if they thought their violations would first be detected and second punished.
Yes.
So implicitly that says you have to have monitoring, verification, and a credible threat of that you will retaliate for a violation. So this is not a new concept, it's a very old concept, over half a century.
Well, I cite that article.
Yeah. So now take a look at the Iran deal. There's a lovely article by Reuters today that quotes Section T of the Iran agreement, which
Ollie High Noonan and David Albright.
but this is a news story, and it says that the Section T bans, quote, it bans activities which could contribute to the development of a nuclear explosive device, unquote. For example, developing explosive detonation systems. Okay. The agreement explicitly bans it. However, this section makes no mention of how this provision will be verified. And the Therefore, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is responsible for overseeing this agreement, is doing no monitoring and no verification of Iran's compliance with this provision of the agreement. So we can't even get to that question of punishment because there's actually no monitoring or verification. So since we've known for over half a century you need to have these sorts of provisions for monitoring and verification and credible punishment in an agreement, how is it possible that after years of negotiating this deal, we got a deal that has no monitoring or verification of this crucial aspect of the deal? How does something like that happen? You weren't in the government at this time, so you can speak about it.
You stop beating your wife.
This does remind me of some of my testimony on the Hill, which is, I think I'm being led toward a particular answer.
Maybe.
Let me kind of take it apart. I agree with much of the premise of your question. The one place I would push back a little bit and then answer it is, I don't think it is strictly true to say that folks aren't monitoring that. That's certainly one of the responsibilities of national intelligence organizations. Because we have this agreement doesn't mean that we don't care about what Iran might be doing in weapons development and using all of the technology and all of the intelligence and sources.
But you would agree the IAEA is not monitoring and verifying it, and yet the IAEA says Iran is in compliance with the agreement.
And it's also not entirely clear to me about what might be going on behind the scenes in the IAEA about. At some point, they have to reach a greater conclusion, broader conclusion about the nature of Iran program, just as they do for other states. And so there is a certain amount of work that will be part of that. The part of it, your question kind of leads me to something that I wish I had said, is I said that sometimes, when you're an intelligence officer and you're involved in the monitoring business, you're the meat of the sandwich between the real advocates of arms control and those that don't like arms control. One of the areas where I have been a skunk at the garden party from time to time, I really like inspections and I really like information exchange. I've already said I think there's a flaw because we don't have the information exchange I would have liked to have had from Iran. I understand, I knew some of the negotiators, I understand why it was hard to get. Wise folks can differ about should they have pressed harder or not, but it would have been nice to have had that. There's something about inspections too, and this is where sometimes I disagree with some of my colleagues in the U.S. government. I think inspections, whatever type of arms control or non-proliferation agreement we're talking about, don't need to be accusations of bad behavior. It ought to be a matter of right and routine, even challenge type inspections. And I have argued in the past that I think in places like Iran, we ought to encourage, not that we know for sure there's something bad going on in this facility, but we want to exercise our right or the right of the IAEA. According to the provisions that you cited, they could go a place. Not that we're accusing Iran of bad behavior or anybody else, but because the agreement lets us do this. And sometimes it's hard to convince the policy world and the diplomatic world that we ought to do that from time to time. But I think it's good to exercise that right, because then it lets you come back and first of all, it begins to build that dialogue, which is, we can manage this inspection in ways, this is not a threat to your national sovereignty, but it helps relieve some of the concerns we have and helps establish best practices for the future. So in that sense, I would like to see a bit more aggressiveness in a number of agreements. I should say I testified on the Chemical Weapons Convention. You noted that in your introduction. And one of the things I remember testifying to was that we will, the OPCW, I'm sure, will do challenge inspections that are part of the Chemical Weapons Convention to exercise that right, and I sort of encourage that. I think the only two that have been done up until the recent Syria case were invited inspections in a way that right had not been exercised. Sir.
Sir, with mobilization of how Russia's moving forces, like they're doing the largest air exercise they have over by China and North Korea. They just did a Pacific Fleet over there. How do you have a conversation with a country where the this high since World War II, where we're 1 Earth away from starting World War III. And they continually shoot missiles. If that missile were to have a malfunction and hit Japan, it becomes a first strike rule. How do we have that conversation, not just with Korea, but with China and Russia, to say, hey, if this happens, it's not World War II?
Well, I think the sorts of things that you suggest underscore why you have to have those conversations. Whether you're doing government to government or you're doing with ex-government people in a variety of ways. There has to be this conversation and this sense of transparency about what's happening because the risk of miscalculation and accident are so high. Even in Syria, we have certain dialogue I read with the Russians about rules of engagement and who's doing what to keep our forces from being in conflict. It's clear we're going to need more of that in Northeast Asia as this situation unfolds. And I'm assuming there's a lot of that dialogue going on. I just don't know what it is. So, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of sabotage, like the Stuxnet virus, and the role of rhetoric, like tweets that are going back and forth? How do they fit into this?
Well, I think in terms of cyber, I was struck that there have been 2 recent statements by former senior government officials about some of the leverage on North Korea might in fact be cyber. I think one was Leon Panetta that said it, the other was Admiral Stavridis, both of whom said there's a card the U.S. could play that might increase pressure. And again, I'm quoting them about what they think might be possible to do. And some of that you can do quietly, so it's not an affront to the North Korean regime, but maybe sends a message. I had a missile test that didn't go off the way I thought it would because my computer failed and stuff. Or I had a power failure at the site. I don't know what. I have no particular insight other than to pass on what those 2 individuals and others have said. But you also put your question into the strategic messaging. There are times I think when you want to be tough and send tough signals, it's important that it not just only be tough signals. That you don't want to draw red lines and let people cross it because then it undermines the next time you draw a red line, and then it leads to sorts of miscalculation that the last questioner was getting at. And I also believe very much, as I said in response to another question, even at the height of the Cold War, when we and the Soviets were engaged in proxy conflict in a variety of ways, and we knew that we could annihilate the others in a whole variety of ways, you could have a respectful conversation about let's not hurt each other. Here's what's at stake. And I think it might be important to send some signals to North Korea, for example, that bad things could happen, but also do it in a context of we can work our way through this if you understand what the stakes are, and then have the Chinese and the Russians and the Japanese and the South Koreans and others have stakes reinforcing the same message. It is a team sport. Sir.
Seems to me that Russia has different priorities in this than China does. And that China has a very, very big role in this. And I can see Russia wanting to instigate things at the detriment of China. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
It's an interesting. You're absolutely right. There are differences in the equities of Russia and China. I'm not sure. I've heard Russian experts, academics,
Consider who's running Russia.
speak to this sort of thing. Well, and that's what I was trying to, because my initial inclination would be much like yours. That Russia can be a real problem, and they may be. On the other hand, Russia's interests are still largely in Europe. There's some economic interests they have in Northeast Asia. Important naval facility there. They've got pipelines and a whole variety of things. But it is not in Russia's interest to see the U.S. building up its military forces in general and in Northeast Asia. Certainly not in the Chinese interest in a variety of ways. But I think the Russians, and again, John Lauder, might actually be more amenable to certain sets of negotiated solutions there, because they're trying to balance this out with China too and others. I don't think they would want an outcome that left China to be an even more dominant player in Northeast Asia than they are now. And Russia does not want to expend a substantial amount of resources toward a Korean crisis. So I think that tempers their ability to make mischief. I heard an expert once wrote on this, and he said actually in some ways Putin probably wouldn't mind seeing Korean unification. Again, I don't know if this is right or wrong. This is just an academic who said it. Because in some ways it's kind of the public case he's trying to make for what he's doing in Ukraine and Crimea. And he might like to point to a solution in Korea that justifies some of what he's done. Don't know if that's good analysis or bad analysis, but it's sort of part of an answer to your question. Sir.
Okay, at this point in late September, to what extent do you think the Trump administration and the leader of North Korea are having some type of back channel communication unbeknownst to the rest of the world?
I would, and again, I don't know anything. And if I did know anything, I couldn't say. So let's start with the premise that I don't know anything. I'd be really surprised if there wasn't some back channel communication. You've got some pros around, and people like Secretary Mattis, for example. You've got folks that are outside of government that have ties. I don't know how extensive they are. Don't know if they take place at all. But I would be more surprised if there wasn't any quiet conversation going on someplace.
Do you think the parties have been empowered by both their leaders to be?
That I don't know. I would not be surprised to find that to be the case. Look at Iran, for example. When you go back in the history of how we came to the game of Iran, there was a lot of quiet things that were going on in various channels, discussions elsewhere in the Middle East. And it's appropriate in the situation that we're in that if there are such things, they stay quiet to see what might be possible.
Let's say thank you, Joe. We're going to have to